unleashing female power.
Being a disruptor.
I'm always constantly telling the truth.
I love
art. That's all her life.
She's alive and female.
Being a woman, what it meant.
Prove him wrong.
Girls run the world.
We're rocking the place.
Welcome to the Art Pod. I'm your host, Carolina, and I'll be your guide through this Pandora's box. Strap yourselves in for a journey through the art world where we bring you candid conversations, untold stories, uncover industry secrets, and celebrate the women who are shaping its future. Because in the Art Pod, the spotlight is always on the girls. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Art Pod. My guest today is Tenley Bick. Welcome.
Thank you, Carolina. Hi, everyone.
So Tenley is an associate professor of art history at Florida State University and an art historian of global, modern, and contemporary art with special interests in post-World War II and contemporary European, especially Italian, and African art, continental and diasporic, with a focus on social art history and cultural geopolitics. She is the author of the book Michelangelo Pistoletto, Figuration and Cultural Politics, that you see here. The first English language scholarly monograph on the Italian artist. Dr. Bick's scholarship has been published in a range of journals, including Third Text, Portable Gray, African Arts, Wooden Image, and the International Yearbook of Futurism Studies, among other venues and edited volumes. She is also the curator of the peer-reviewed bilingual digital project Costellazione, mapping new directions in contemporary Italian art and activism. She's currently working on a second book on contemporary art and visual always hard time saying this, post-coloniality in and around Italy, focused on works of art by contemporary Italian, Afro-Italian, and East African artists that address histories and legacies of Italian colonialism in Africa. All right. Well, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's start with your current role. You are the associate professor of global and modern and contemporary art at Florida State University and the director of undergraduate studies. Before that, you began as the assistant professor from 2018 to 2024. You teach global, modern, and contemporary art and contemporary arts of Africa. So let's maybe begin a little bit about what your day to day and your responsibilities kind of look like.
Sure. So I'm at what we call a research university, and it's a big public university. Lots of people know Florida State, but in academia, sometimes there are, I think, a tendency to understand the role of a professor as just the life of the mind, right? And there can be very different roles for academics depending on what kind of institution you're affiliated with and working for. And so I'm at a research university, which means that my duties are not primary. I mean, I teach a lot. It's half my job, but it's not all of my job, right? And so a quarter of my time is supposed to be dedicated to my research and my scholarship. About a quarter of it is dedicated to my administrative duties, particularly as director of undergraduate studies, but also my other service roles in the university. I sit, for example, on the undergraduate policy committee for the entire university, which has been a really interesting role, and other committee work across the department, college, and university at large, as well as my service to the field. So things that I would do with other professional organizations. I just finished being the president of the Italian Art Society, a scholarly organization in North America. So things like that, that's also part of my job. Then the other half is teaching, right? And so that's divided between my instruction of classes, so undergraduate students as well as graduate students. We have graduate programs in our department, as well as advising. So advising PhD students, MA students, and also advising all of the undergrads in my role as director of undergraduate studies. So it's a fantastic job. I'm really lucky and happy to have it. And I really like being in public education. You know, I think it's, I went to a public MA PhD program at UCLA, and we have wonderful undergrads. And I feel like the kind of large amount of resources that are available for library work, for research support, you know, it's rewarding, but also well supported, right, for research and scholarship. So those are primarily my duties. Now that this book is wrapped up, I'm excited that it's out in the world. So some of my research and scholarship time are dedicated to planning, you know, book promotions, book talks, but also getting to move on to my next book, which I've been really excited to spend more time with. And so, part of moving up to associate and achieving tenure, you have to have a second project. So I've sort of steadily been publishing from it, but I'm excited now that I understand more about the book process to really build that next book into my second monograph.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on in the conversation.
Sure.
I wanted to get kind of a sense of how your process of getting tenure was at FSU.
Yeah, so we have a 6-year clock. That's your tenure clock, right? And some places are a little longer, depends on the institution. You really end up getting ready to go up by the end of year 5 is when your packet has to be ready. So we're more on a 5-year clock. So it's really intensive. And every different kind of institution will have their own standards, right, for tenure. And that should be relative to other peer institutions. So if you're predominantly a liberal arts college and you don't have graduate programs and you're in a teaching position, that will look one way. If you're at a university and you're in a research university in particular, you'll have very different tenure standards. So for me, I had to have the book, not necessarily out, but it had to be on its way. I had to make sure I had a second project from which I had already published and established, scholarship from. And then there's the kind of amount of articles that you need to publish. It's not necessarily codified with a certain kind of X number of articles, X number of edited chapters or chapters in an edited volume, but a record enough that you have a national, if not international, reputation as a scholar. During tenure review, of course, you're evaluated by your peers in your department and by administration in the university, but there's predominantly the major import of external review. So people, senior scholars in your field, particularly in your area of expertise, who can evaluate your record of scholarship and your teaching and your service and all the contributions you've made as a kind of research professor, and including your book, right? And then they write a letter. And ideally, you really shouldn't know these people very well. Of course, we're in a small field. You're going to have some interactions. So that can be, tricky. But as long as you haven't co-authored anything together or co-edited a volume together, nothing where there would be a major conflict of interest, you want to have a number of scholars, full professors in the field, right? If not emeritus as well. Ideally, full professors, that's the top rank, who will evaluate your work and write a letter saying whether or not they think you should have tenure and why. Right? And so it's a scary process.
I was about to say.
Certainly. And, for me in particular, I work in fields I work generally in global modern and contemporary art, but I also work extensively in contemporary African art, which tends to be held apart. And institutionally and discursively speaking, typically, the expectations are that only Africanist art historians exclusively would be working on that, right? So people who also teach historical and traditions-based practices, which I'm trained to do, I can do. But I came out of a program UCLA, that really supported my desire to work in both Africanist art history and modern and contemporary art, which historically has been very Eurocentric and Western-centric. And that's changing, which is wonderful. But at that time, I was there from the late aughts to the mid-teens, and they really said, you can do both, right? And so I was first published in Africanist art history. And of course, my next project really makes obvious how I see some of the connections between the two. But it was difficult in the tenure process to make sure I could have scholars who might only be able to speak to part of my work, right? From either side. I had to get a lot of letters to make sure I could demonstrate, that all areas of my work were of that standard. So it's interesting too how even the shape of the field or how departments and subfields are set up at an institutional level can also influence some of this procedure and make it different for each individual.
Yeah. I find tenure to be incredibly, well, coming from the professional sort of trajectory that most of us have, tenure is so unusual because you essentially can never get fired, right?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So
explain that to me.
Yeah. So you can get fired. It would have to be a kind of negligent, a kind of negligence and refusal to do your work.
Okay.
It used to be more protected than it's becoming now. Increasingly, there are things like post-tenure review, where individuals who have tenure are evaluated on a X-year basis, right, to make sure that, you're still doing your job. You're ideally still active in your field. That's why they've invested in you in the long term. And, so beyond the very basic, you're teaching your classes. Hopefully you're still publishing, right? And I think it can be, for many people, I'll just say that is seen as a kind of threat to tenure and to the academic freedom that it's meant to protect. That there aren't political actors who intersect with any kind of institution, including higher ed, can't put pressure on you to do certain kinds of work, right? And so there are real reasons, right, for tenure and to give you more time, right, to develop projects that are of significant intellectual contribution. So that's one side. On the other side, there is a desire to make sure that people you're investing in are still doing your work, right? And I understand both sides. For me, I'm thrilled to have tenure. I think it's given me an ability to be able to sit with this next project, a little bit longer and make sure that if I need to go do more archival research, I can do that, right? And or if I need to get that special image I want in the book, I can do that. And to also take time to develop kind of new areas of work too. So it gives you that support. It is an immensely stressful process. Getting tenure, immensely stressful. And so, receiving it, it's not just the 6 years or the 5 years or the 7 years, like at some institutions that you're pursuing it. You have already worked so hard just to get a tenure track job, and there are fewer and fewer of those jobs in academia. Increasingly, there is an attrition in the job market of available tenure track jobs, and that has to do with, on the one hand, people aren't retiring. On the other hand, universities are tending to replace tenure track lines, an individual line for a faculty position, with either adjunct instruction or just cutting lines, period. Right? So it's a twofold process. And so the dream of getting the tenure track job, you've already worked so hard. You've been through the years of the PhD program. You're thrilled you've got this position. Then you have to get tenure, right? And so really, I've been working toward this since my early 20s. And the kind of longue durée of that process, it wears on you, and I'm extremely lucky and privileged to be in this position. I also worked really, really hard. So it feels good to have some security in that. But it's not a just carte blanche, you can do whatever you want situation.
I was about to say,
which is the popular understanding, and I get that. So
I'm glad that you cleared that up. Thank you.
Yes.
But it does offer, obviously, a security sense, and you can stay at that university for as long as you want. As long
as I want.
Okay.
Yeah, which is great.
Yeah.
And I have a fantastic home institution, and the research support's incredible. I have wonderful colleagues. We have great resources for the students, super smart students as well. So I'm very happy where I am.
Yeah, I'm glad that you touched on some of the challenges and bureaucracy of academia, because I feel like it's such a veiled sort of thing, and you don't really understand it until you're really in it.
It is,
and a lot of people have questions about that, and it is really hard to be there, because like you said, you're working first, an insane amount of time to get a PhD, and then you're also working, eventually on getting this tenure, which is a process in and of itself, and it takes time.
Yeah, it takes a long time, and some of the work that I've done too, like my digital project, there are certain metrics in tenure review where that kind of work wouldn't necessarily, at least initially, be seen as valid work. Then it was peer reviewed. So that changed things. So, part of my work, I was really determined to make more publicly accessible and to be able to generate some valuable primary resources. So interviews with artists is the focus of my own digital project. And making that available to broader audiences at a time where, we were during the pandemic, institutions were closed, just to try to continue that process. And much of that work generated primary content for my second book. So it's nice that there are increasingly journals in particular that are supporting scholarship that might be in a digital format, right? And using peer review to recognize the scholarly contributions of that kind of work as well. So, but certainly tenure is veiled, right?
Yeah.
And academia is veiled.
Yeah.
And there's always a joke going around about, what our parents think we do as art historians, what the general public thinks we do as art historians. Invariably, at some point, I'm behind an easel painting, right? And that's one of the first questions I was like, oh, are you an artist? And I wish. Thank God we have artists. We wouldn't have art history without it. And you have to take, you have to be trained in some fine art processes. But no, I'm not an artist. My mother is, so a little bit apple tree there. But so.
No, you're totally right. The first question is always like, oh, are you an artist?
Exactly.
I'm just like, no, and this is what I'm trying to do with this podcast, to kind of let people understand how many different roles you can actually have in the art field.
Right.
And academia is obviously special in that, it's very research heavily based.
Yes.
That is primarily what your job is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that just having that understanding alone is so much further afield than even, especially being in the humanities.
Yeah.
Art history at FSU is housed in the Fine Arts College. So the fine arts discipline, creative disciplines, instead of what's called the College of Arts and Sciences, where the social sciences and other humanities disciplines are. We're really a humanistic discipline, right? And there tends to be some of the confusion lies insofar as, are you artists, right? Or you in the arts, is your work creative? Right? Tends to be sometimes, because of its placement, frequently either conflated with art programs, so art and art history departments, those exist, or placement in the fine arts college, which makes sense for a lot of reasons. Art students need to take art history and vice versa, and their financial reasons to house things in the same college. But no, I'm not an artist. I'm very much a researcher and a historian. So
yeah. But going back to the other side of your profession, teaching, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
You've won actually several teaching awards. In 2024, an Innovation and Teaching Award for undergraduate and graduate, Outstanding Teaching in Major, and Outstanding Graduate Teaching. And in 2020, you were nominated for the Honors Thesis Mentor Award. What do you find most rewarding about teaching?
So I will, just a clarification, those later awards I was nominated for.
Yes,
all of
nominated,
those.
Sorry.
And so I will find out in a number of months what I received. But receiving the nomination obviously is feels really good. I really love teaching. I like opening kind of in some way to students new ways to see the world, right? To think about not just art, but visual culture around them, and to understand how images and visual forms relay and construct meaning. So I think for me, getting students to not only be trained in content, but in skills, such that they then can see that they can be generators of knowledge themselves, that they can be contributors, right, to these discourses, and that they can also think critically about the world around them. I think that, to me, is some of the most exciting and maybe valuable part of teaching. I always love, there are examples where students have gone on and achieved great goals. I had 2 PhD students finish in the same year last year. They were my first advisees, and one received a tenure track job while she was before she had finished. The other is in a fantastic visiting position. Both have incredible research, and one won a Fulbright. They did really, really well, and they worked really hard for that. And so, I see myself as kind of a facilitator and a mentor in that process. And it's really fulfilling to see your students go on and do well, and to do their work, right? It's not my work, it's their work. Right? And to see them do that is really exciting, right? And I particularly, I think, have a kind of special place in my professional heart for undergraduate teaching. I think oftentimes undergraduates are not seen as students who are really ready to do something yet in terms of original research, especially. And I don't think that's true. Yeah, you need to teach them more. They need to learn how to write and research, right? That's why they're there. But I think they're really curious, smart people. And I've seen some incredible research come from undergraduates. And so I really don't like when people underestimate undergraduate students. Yeah. It's not something you see egregiously, but there often is a tendency in academia to really focus on graduate programs. And you don't become a graduate student unless you've been an undergraduate. So exactly. I've really enjoyed some of what I've been able to do at FSU is in my role as director of undergraduate studies is be able to reshape some of that curriculum, make sure they have an extra research seminar, things like that, because I've seen what they're capable of.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what the teaching is.
So you mentioned that you're also an advisor for postgraduates and master thesis.
Yeah,
also?
so master's theses and PhD students, dissertations.
And what's kind of the process like to be an advisor for those things?
Yeah, so everybody has their own advising style and expectations. And I think for me, I have high expectations for my students. I always tell them that. And also tell them that I have complete confidence in them, because I do. But it can be such a scary process going into an MA or a PhD, and especially beginning to face and construct the huge monster of the dissertation. Everybody who's writing a dissertation, generally speaking, has not written a dissertation before, right? And so it feels really kind of nebulous and scary, and you tend to think, well, I'm going to sit down and write my dissertation. It just seems like this huge thing that's impossible. And so some of what teaching entails in those advising roles can be getting students to understand kind of where students are coming from a psychological perspective. If they're not feeling confident and supported as learners, then it's going to be very difficult for them to succeed in the more concrete research and writing elements of a dissertation. So some of what I think about is, how to help them, create and identify feasible goals, right? Mm-hmm. Each one along the way, how to understand the process, make sure they have the research skills, suggestions for bibliography, perhaps, that they don't know. And also just regular meetings. I like to get my students, especially when I had students at kind of the same period in the PhD program, we would have kind of group advising meetings. And it was a way to kind of give them some community during a process that can be very isolating, And so some of it has to do with kind of managing student feelings a little bit, and not in a weird controlling way, but just making sure that they feel supported and that they know it's going to be hard, and that feeling of doubt is normal. Yeah. So, yeah.
No, I mean, I wrote my own master thesis, so I know the process and how crazy it can be. Yeah. And till this day, I think Professor Barech, I absolutely love her. She was my thesis professor.
Wonderful.
If I didn't have her as my thesis professor, I don't think I'd finish it. She knew me so well. She knew I was a classic procrastinator. I waited till the 11th hour to do all my work, panic, all of that stuff. So she made me submit like pages throughout the process to make sure that I was actually working on something. Yeah. And she really guided me and pushed me to explore topics that I normally wouldn't have thought of. Yeah. So she was like critical in me getting my master's. And I think being that sort of teacher where you actually care and know the student that you're working with is so critical. Yeah.
It is a very individualized process. It's not one size fits all. Some people respond to kind of different ways of advising than others. And so I'm also learning from them, right? So what are you researching? Tell me what you found this week, right? And so some of it is dialogical, right? And there will be times when they'll say something and I'm like, okay, well, I need to look more into this, think about some bibliography, that we can look at together in some cases. So it can be collaborative. It can be focused on kind of psychological support, learning the students' research and writing and learning style, as you've mentioned. So it can be really challenging. It also can be really rewarding. I was here in New York for the College Art Association conference, and I saw my former PhD student, my first advisee, get up and give her first CAA conference paper, and she did fantastically well. And it was a really proud moment, And then I ran into my own advisor in the hallway. So, it's sort of full circle. Yeah.
Small world also.
Very.
Speaking about these students, because you've been teaching for some time now, do you see sort of like any, I don't want to say trends, but any sort of things that are changing with each new generation?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting. I get, some of this reflects on applications, right, to PhD programs, students who apply to study under you in the MA or PhD program. And those interests have been pretty varied in recent years. Certainly, there, I think, are a number of students who are increasingly interested in areas of the field that are starting to develop. The field by which I mean post-war and contemporary art history. So in recent decades, there has been a turn to pay more attention, for example, to areas of the world, cultural areas, geographical regions, whose creative practices tended to be positioned as a subset of predominantly US American and Western European practices, or to be under-examined, often because of some of the politics of the region. So famously, Eastern European socio-communist regions had been very understudied until the last 15, 10, 20 years or so. And that research is starting to really become more prominent. Journals are looking more closely at the intersections, right, between artists, for example, in former Yugoslavia and the international networks they were a part of. So it's interesting to see somehow directions in the field. That's one example. There's been a proliferation, I think, of new work also in focused on Latin American modernism, right? And modernisms, really. And so it's been interesting to see the field grapple with its own limitations historically, and to see students really get interested in these growing areas of the field. To me, it's always interesting to think about how, you know, somebody who works in, like myself, who works in African art history, but whose first book was about a post-war Italian artist, that very much seems to fit the model, right, of the kind of conventional, right, post-war and contemporary art histories. But there's so much about Italy and Italian art in the history of art history itself that I think that if you can look at this kind of work in its respective context, in its local environment, as well as the global themes with which it connects. And then in my other project, also think about it in relationship to post-colonialism and to colonial histories of Italy. Suddenly the stakes are much larger than those small areas of the field, right? That you can be thinking about art history as, in so many ways, fundamentally an Italianist discipline. You know, the earliest art historians were Italian, right? And you think about Vasari and the lives of the artists, you know, and so some of the, I think, things we see in the field, that's part of why I'm interested in post-war Italian art. So I was delighted a couple of years ago to get an application from a student who really wants to work on kind of post-colonial issues in contemporary Italian and Mediterranean art. And she's like, that's why I'm applying to work with you. So it's exciting to see students, I think, responding to the changes in the field, right? And to think about how they can go on and you know, continue to change it.
Well, that's good to know that, you know, we're actually progressing forward rather than backwards.
Definitely.
So apart from teaching and, you know, doing your research, you also write and you also sometimes organize panels or lectures or conferences. You speak at conferences also. Can you kind of walk us through the process of either applying for or being asked to do a conference?
Sure. Yeah. So depends on the conference, right? Typically, what will circulate is what's called a CFP, or a call for papers, or a call for panels. And you can sometimes submit an entirely formed panel, right, in which you have the organizers and chair or chairs, and then you'll have the speakers, their respective topics and abstracts that you've already put together, and then you submit that to the conference. That's one way to do it. Some conferences allow that, some don't. Another way to do it is to, let's say you have a topic that you really want to solicit new work on, right? And maybe it's certainly something you're working on as well. You can then submit a panel proposal to a conference, and then if they accept it, it's then an open panel that you then advertise and call for papers submissions for. You receive the proposals. You decide then as chair and organizer who's going to be on the panel, right? So those are two different ways you can do panels. For papers, you can certainly give a paper on your own panel if you like, but you can also submit to other people's panels, right? Sometimes those panels will be fully formed, right? And so somebody is thinking about a number of scholars who are working on a project and will say, I'd love for you to submit a paper to this, and sometimes that's with the understanding that there will then be a selection. And sometimes it's like, please be on my panel. I really want your work in this. And then it's, you're a part of whatever is submitted fully to the conference. So there are a couple of different ways to go about it. I always encourage early career scholars to participate in graduate student symposia. So conferences that are exclusively for graduate students. Those will often be paired with a very prominent scholar speaking as the keynote. So it's a nice way to kind of introduce younger scholars or emerging scholars to the field, to more prominent figures. After that, you can go on and submit to regional conferences. You can then move on to national conferences or international conferences, and they kind of go up in size and prestige, and they all have their own sort of culture for different conferences. Some are known as very supportive conferences and will give you really positive questions and feedback. And some are known as sort of a shooting ground to tear people apart. And,
wow. Okay.
Oh, yes. It's invariably a man who will stand up and say, well, this is really more of a comment than a question. This is sort of a famous trope in the field. And so I shouldn't say exclusively, but it's usually men. And so those kinds of experiences, it can be wonderful. You get great feedback on your work, and it can also be a way to kind of learn and develop your professional, acumen, your ability to navigate, questions in real time. And so it's always nice to be able to see senior scholars, how they navigate this, and to kind of learn by attending, even if you're not speaking, go to conferences, right? See people speak, see what methods of presentation and scholarship you most gravitate toward, you find convincing as a listener. Right? Go to topics that have nothing to do with your research, right? Learn what else is going on in the field. And that kind of experience, right, by just attending will give you a really great way to kind of think about what kind of scholar and presenter you want to be. I also participate in Italian studies conferences, particularly like the American Association for Italian Studies. So oftentimes your work as an art historian, in this case, might intersect with disciplines that are housed in cultural studies, or I have some colleagues who go to archaeology conferences, different disciplines, but, connect to your kind of interdisciplinary work. So those are always, I think, great to intersect with, because you see what's going on in other fields, and that can be a really rewarding experience.
Yeah. No, that's a great tip, because I always say that to people as well. I'm like, never stop learning. Go to things and listen to lectures that have nothing to do with you.
Completely.
Yeah. But speaking about research and conferences and all of that stuff, some of the topics of research and teaching that you focus on include artistic internationalism and its cultural politics after World War II, post-colonial modernisms, diasporic cinemas, historiography, and global politics, and artistic labor and process, among others. Your work on Italian art focuses on arte povera, internationalism, and politics in the 1960s and 70s, as well as contemporary art and post-coloniality. Can you tell me what first drew you to these topics? Because they tend to be, I feel like, very niche in academia. Yeah. Or maybe I'm wrong, but I never really, those aren't at the forefront, I feel like, at least not in the circles that I run in.
Sure. I think I definitely have a, how would I describe it? My research profile is somewhat distinctive. I think particularly given that I also work in Africanist art history. And at first to show you kind of how the field is changing, at first when, I was on the academic job market, some people sort of looked at me like I had two heads. How can you possibly work on modern contemporary African art and post-war Italy? To me, I don't know how you can think about post-war Europe without thinking about the decline of European colonialism. Yep. And vice versa. How can I think about modern contemporary African practices, depending on the region, of course, without dealing with histories of intersection with Europe, right? And so, to me, they're fundamentally intersected. But even if they weren't, right, let's say they weren't, I think that there's something to be said, especially for contemporary art historians, to be able to develop acumen in a secondary field, even if that's, incorrectly divided in the discipline. we're working scholars, and yeah, there's something to be said for expertise. But if you can be trained in, by which I mean take graduate level courses in, qualifying exams in, or minor exams in, if it's a secondary area, and you can publish, teach, and do conferences in that area before you hit the academic job market, then you're a much more attractive candidate, right, to institutions who are looking to hire you. There are so many PhDs in contemporary art history. It is the largest subfield in the discipline. There are wonderful people who just don't get jobs, right? And so that's not why I pursued this. I was really interested in it, but it became a major asset to me. And I'm so grateful I went to a place that was happy to support me in doing both. And when I first hit the market, like some people, and even earlier on, how can you be working on Italy and work on other things? That didn't go over with some people. And that's not to criticize them necessarily. It's just a different approach, right, to this field than what had conventionally been done. And increasingly, it's becoming something where it's, you have this really distinctive approach to being able, to approach post-war and contemporary art history in Italy, right, as from a post-colonial viewpoint, and so I think there are opportunities there that we are starting to see fields change in. To some degree, I think art history lags behind in that. I have had a lot of support and collegial collaborations with people in Italian studies. Sometimes Italianist art history can be a bit of a holdout.
Yeah.
Apologies to my fellow Italianists. I have kind of a weird relationship to being an Italianist. I'm sort of an anti-Italianist. I think I look at it in a much broader frame. And I love Italian art and Italianist art history, clearly.
Yes.
I just think that I look at it as intersected with much broader histories. And so, I think with regard to developing these interests, some of this also had to do with my undergraduate education, like that early. I went to Stanford for my undergrad. I immediately declared art history as soon as I took an architectural history course that I was completely enamored by. It was with Professor Paul Turner, who's an architectural historian. And I just loved it. It was on modern architecture. And I also declared a minor in urban studies, which is where the architecture and design track was housed at the time at Stanford. And then I started working on Italian just out of interest in learning another language. I trained a lot in French, and I wanted to learn Italian. I loved Italy, and I was able to pursue that. And so I ended up writing an honors thesis on Daniel Buren, the French conceptual artist, 68, major institutional critique figure. Had a wonderful moment here in 2005, longer ago than I care to say, when I was finishing my honors thesis on his work, and he had the show at the Guggenheim. And out of naivete and maybe young courage, I got up the guts to introduce myself to him, and he was so lovely. And it was a really nice moment in New York. But I applied to graduate school later, thinking I wanted to continue work around 1968 in France. And turned out that my language skills from Italian and some of the coursework I was taking, particularly a seminar on post-war European art with George Baker, who became my PhD advisor, I was really interested in Pistoletto's work. And there was some scholarship coming out at the time, and I thought, I can actually do this primary research. I have the language skills. I'd minored in Italian as well. So it's sort of funny that I ultimately was working on an artist and an avant-garde tied to a city with a very particular history in Italy. So all three areas of my art historical formation ended up somewhat organically becoming the major area of my focus in my doctoral studies and now in my book. And at the same time, I was taking classes in Africanist art history with Stephen Nelson, who is now the dean of the Center, formerly the Center of Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery in DC. And he was at UCLA for a long time, and I loved his courses. And I was so interested in Africanist art history. And so he, gave me a research position for a summer when I needed a job, and he encouraged me to publish my work. And so I think some of the teaching I got from him also gave me the confidence to work in both of those areas. And so some of the result of those kinds of niche areas, as you said, came from that. the interest in process and contemporary artistic labor also dates to my graduate studies, and probably also to the fact that I'm an artist daughter. We had a dark room growing up, a giant loom. She was working in photography and textile, and then took a long break and now works in encaustic. So she's a really interesting, my mother's an incredible woman. So I was always around creativity. My dad did incredible, really intricate carpentry as well. So we were kind of a weird creative household. But in graduate school, I was in a practicum seminar on land art. And I remember my professor, Mi-Wan Kwan, was working on this research on early Rauschenberg. And he made these weird paintings that were filled with dirt and growing plants. And he would ostensibly water it at Betty Parsons' gallery in New York. And it was called Growing Painting. I had no idea how he put this thing together. And she said, I think you should make it. I said, really? She said, oh, yeah, And so I tried to make it. And from there, I sort of thought more critically about work like Michelangelo's as well, that seems to suggest a certain kind of process behind it visually. It looks like maybe it was put together quickly or sort of slapdash or DIY aesthetic, when in fact it can be incredibly labor intensive. And so that disjuncture between what I sometimes think of as kind of procedural aesthetics, what the work looks, how it looks like it's been made versus how it was actually made. That tension to me is really interesting in research. So all of this is to say, a lot of it came from my studies. Some of it came from my personal background, my kind of weird predilection to think about what artists are doing. And then I also had incredible mentors, you know, and all of them played a role in supporting me and encouraging me to pursue these topics.
I was always interested about how you came into especially Italian art because you weren't Italian.
No.
And obviously we met at Magazzino, which is an Italian institution. So I was always like, I wonder how she got into this topic of like interest.
Yeah. People always, you don't have any Italian heritage?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I wish I did. I love Italy. Some of it was just an interest in, some of it probably had to do with the fact that I, was studying art history, but I was never really gravitating towards the Renaissance. Maybe to the Baroque. I think the Baroque is super interesting and weird. And Baroque architecture fascinated me, still fascinates me. So some of it had to do with that, I'm sure. But I really was just fascinated by some of the literature and poetry and films that came out of this incredible place. And so, I was there was a great French and Italian department at Stanford. And again, they were really supportive of undergrads. They, let me do an independent study on a topic of my choice. And then I presented at the graduate conference, things that don't usually happen in institutions. So I'm really grateful to those opportunities. And then, when I was in graduate school, I received an external fellowship, and I also had internal funding. So I was able to live in Torino for almost 2 years during my doctoral studies. And that's, I think, when really my language skills were consolidated, my deep love for Italy, and especially for that area of the country, came to fruition. I'm not sure what it is. I love Italy. I think Italian art of this period is so fascinating. Its connection to labor histories and this tumultuous, period around the 60s, and also just to artists like Pistoletto, who seem to be driven by this strange drive to make things that all artists have, but in ways that really defied conventions, not just of what art objects should look like, but also what artistic practice should look like. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. I remember being a PhD student living in Turin and going to some of the, where his historical studio was and peeping and, trying to like kind of reimagine what it was like to do these things. And I think it just was a really incredible opportunity and a period that, will continue to fascinate me for some time. Even seeing Pistoletto works in New York, I was thinking, oh, maybe I could you've got the book out. Think about other things for a little bit.
So now that we're actually segueing to talking about Pistoletto, I think this is a good chance for us to talk a little bit about the book.
Sure.
So let's start with this labor of love, because you mentioned to me that it took almost like 7 years to put together. Walk me through the process.
Yeah, it was preceded. I first started researching Pistoletto's work in graduate school in 2009. That was like my very first, paper. And I then, it coincided wonderfully with some major events around his work, the 2010 retrospective at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I first saw many of them, was curated by Carlos Basualdo. I was able to see many of the works there for the first time. I then went to Italy and to his foundation and archive, and went from there. So it became, I did my dissertation on his work as well, but then it took many, many, many more years of research, interviews, site visits, study of artworks held in the US and Italy, immense research. And it takes a long time to be able to identify some of the most pressing questions that you want to dedicate a project to. Because there are always many interesting questions. And then to also think about, what do I need to do to really be faithful to some of the historical contributions of the work, and how do I put out something that will be meaningful, right? And it was really important to me to make sure that this book honored and made clear his own conceptualization of his practice. Sometimes contemporary art historians don't give enough space to that, I think, or gloss over it. And it's okay if you're not meant to parrot the artist as an art historian. Why would we have art historians then? But you do need to make clear what their conceptualization of their practice is. And so I wanted to make sure I had enough time with him for many interviews, which he was so generous to give to me over the years, just sort of in full faith that a project would eventually come out, And yeah, I'm not Italian. Here's this, young, strange American girl who's like stalking me in Italy. But he was wonderful to work with, and had an amazing archivist in Marco Ferrano, and incredible team in Città dell'Arte. And so it just took time. I also was trying to find materials that weren't extant initially. So I think I mentioned to you that there are a lot of his early design work in this book that we only had one remaining surviving advertisement from that period of his formative career. And I asked for 10 years straight, have you found any of these? Do you have them? And, Marco kept saying, no, we don't have them, And the very last time that I was there for an archive visit before I, was finishing the manuscript, he said, oh, we did find this box a few months ago. And he came out and he put this box on the table, and it was like every holiday, every dream of that an art historian could have, the most incredible, all of his design work, all of his sketches, and all of this really early work. It was phenomenal. And so I was able to get some of those works, now seen for the first time, into the book. So I was really glad to be able to put that into the book. It also included a lot of time in archives, wading through loan documents and shipping receipts and, forgotten letters. There's a work of his in the book that has been known until now by a name. That's not its title. And it was actually sent by Michelangelo and his gallerist in Turin to be on the cover of the show at the Walker, which it's not. It got tied up in customs. I was able to prove it was taken out of customs in time to be in the show. It's not in the show. I think some of that had to do with the politics of the time. That's what I argue in the book, based on other things that, were happening in the reception of post-war Italian art in the 60s in the US. But the Walker was wonderful to work with. What an incredible institution. Gave me so much archival support and had incredible exhibition photography that hadn't been printed. And I'm asking them for enhanced negatives. And so it was a lot of collaboration with archivists, registrars, people I would write to who have nothing to do with art anymore, but who collaborated on a journal with him in the 50s when he had this young artist collective. I said, did you, 60 years ago happen to, I did, So a lot of it was thankfully, due to the great support and collaboration with people who are still alive who collaborated with him, and also to the many, many institutions that provided images and who were able to give me archival documents and support and research time. So it wouldn't have been possible without the many, many people whom I thank in the acknowledgments, which are quite long as a result, including Magazzino, which, was integral to my ability to do this work, supporting scholars early in their careers with research and writing time. That's a huge gift. Yeah.
That's why it took 7 years, is because you contacted literally probably every single human being who has worked with him.
Everyone. People who had not thought about these things in decades and just, oh, yeah, I did. I said, well, and then the annoying questions follow. Do you remember any of them?
Yeah.
And, I have to ask.
Yeah.
And so, it was a really incredible process. And I think about all of the people, these incredible people who gave their time and expertise, right, to somebody who is still early career. I will always be grateful to that, and especially to the artists who sat down and spoke with me. And I remember I went to visit Gianni Piacentino, who was an artist in the 60s associated with Arte Povera, and who had been quite close with Michelangelo. And he's still making incredible work. And he had me to his studio and gave me some materials and gave me an interview. And we shared a pineapple gelato at the end. And, he was just this lovely man. And that kind of generosity of spirit, even without the guarantee of a book to come, just I really appreciate that.
Was there something that you learned throughout this research process that you didn't know and you find incredibly fascinating that we can find in this book?
So the history of the Walker is pretty wild. And I think in terms of the archival discoveries and finds in the book, that's one of them for sure. I can maybe turn to a page if that's okay.
So go for it.
I was really interested early on in this discrepancy between the work that was reproduced on the catalog cover of the exhibition and what the reproduction of the work looked like, which was quite different than the actual work. And I kept looking at it and I thought, this is the weirdest catalog cover. And it was done by a designer at the time at the Walker who had been trained, by great modern designers. And you can see that the reproduction of the work here, this work's at the Detroit Institute of Arts, cut out
like half of it.
The red flag.
Yeah.
This is a communist Italian party flag. Even if you don't know that specifically, it reads as a communist flag. And the protest sign. And this figure here with his, which would have been a tessera that you would wear, a card of your party registration in protests. And also changed the coloring, right? So that the red kerchief, a sign of leftist thought in Italy, that would have all been neutralized in the image. And so these photographs were originally sourced, the series, those images were taken by a friend of Michelangelo's with whom he collaborated for and had known from art school. And they were taken of protests and demonstrations by mostly anti-American and anti-Vietnam War protests, but predominantly electoral rallies for leftist parties in Italy. And he had taken these snapshots and shown them to Michelangelo, and he chose which ones he kind of wanted to work with. And so there was this really interesting series that came out of them, the mirror paintings with the political subjects. And Michelangelo was very clear. If I had wanted to make a political picture, he told me I would have gone much, much further, right? Or, excuse me, he told that to Martin Friedman, the Walker director. And he said to me, in my interviews, he said, well, I don't see these necessarily as political images. So that I want to be clear about. But the political subjects that he was dealing with and how those images, even if they were part of everyday life in Italy at the time, were neutralized in their reception in many ways in the U.S., like that cover on the catalog of his show at the Walker. That to me was really interesting. Like, why did this happen? What were the processes that went into some of the way this work was received? And that series in particular had been kind of really poorly documented and misunderstood in many ways. So a lot of the kind of research in that chapter went into establishing very mechanical facts, right? Where were they shipped? Who lent them? Why did most of them end up in their debut in the United States a year after he makes his, he's making these works, along the same time as he makes some of his now best known works, the Midas objects. And the fact that those things coincide, that to me was a really interesting opportunity to think differently about his work. And so on the cover, you see an image that has never been published before of him standing with one of his Midas objects and looking into the surface of one of these mirror paintings with the political subjects. And so this was an opportunity to look differently at this historical record. I think there's a lot there that readers will be interested in. They did debut in the US, most of them. There was one that was shown in Italy beforehand, and then some of them are shown in Italy after. But, that relationship between art and politics gets a lot messier in that series than in some of the ways I think his work was received initially in the US.
I'm excited to get this book and read through it because I feel like you've uncovered some gems in there.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm really grateful to Michelangelo for all of his interviews. Some of the things he told me along the years, there are many quotes from him there. And some of the archival finds too were really, hopefully very exciting.
Can you walk us a little bit through the process of actually getting this published? How did you source publishers? Did you do proposals? Did you already have Yale Press on board before?
Yeah,
anything?
So this is a good question. People, you learn sort of through experience as an academic, and you know that you have to make a prospectus, a proposal, that will include obviously an outline of the book, its chapters, outline its contributions, discuss related scholarship that's been published and how your work will fit into that and exceed that in different ways, respond to, so on and so forth. But then you also need to have some discussion of its potential readers, right? Marketing opportunities, some of the attractive original material that will be in the work, whether that's new images, previously unknown archival documents, things like that will always be very attractive to a publisher, even an academic publisher. Whether or not this could be read by general audiences or if it's really only for scholars, these kinds of considerations. And then you circulate a chapter or two with that proposal. Some people write the entire manuscript and then send out part of the book or the entire manuscript with the prospectus. Many people will have a book in development and will circulate whatever's done so far, a chapter or two, and say, here's my prospectus, here are my sample chapters, I have X amount done, I'm submitting this for your consideration, right? And you can approach a press, one press at a time. You can also submit to a number of presses at once. So it's a little bit different than submitting an article to a journal, for example. You're not supposed to, carpet bomb journals with your submission. That's not okay. But for book prospectuses, you can write to many different presses and wait to hear from them, right? And so I was really interested in the book being at Yale. It's one of the most prestigious academic presses we have. And their books are always really well designed and beautiful. And that was important to me because obviously for the quality of the images and reproductions, but also because this is the first English language monograph, meaning I should clarify. In a popular context, we often think of a monograph as a book on a solo artist, a single artist. It actually means a single author book. Right. So I mean it in that scholarly sense. Okay. Certainly there have been exhibition catalogs dedicated to solo shows of Pistolettos. But there hadn't been an English language scholarly single author study of his work. And there hadn't been one in any language since the 80s when Bruno Corrao wrote his important but short monograph on the artist in Italian. And so I saw this is one of our most prominent and I think important artists from the post-war through the contemporary period. We need this study. And I think his work offers a very different history to post-war art than we typically have, which has been really dominated by histories of abstraction. And so thus the focus on figuration. In any case, you then circulate your prospectus, your chapters, and you wait right? And you'll have what's called a desk review. Editors get many, many, many proposals, and sometimes they will, you can be rejected, right? Outright, meaning I'm not going to circulate this to experts in the field who will then tell me whether or not this should be published.
Mm-hmm.
Once you get past that desk review, typically the editor will respond and say, thank you so much for your proposal. I am really interested in this. Let's set up a meeting. I didn't want to have the whole book done, and that because it was my first book. I know that editors have a lot more knowledge than I do as a first-time book author about kind of forming the manuscript into a successful book. Right. And so for me, I wanted the ability to work with an editor who could give me some input along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't circulate the whole manuscript at the outset. I submitted part of it and the prospectus and said what I had done and what I had to do. And Yale wanted it, which was fantastic. And I was thrilled. I still remember where I was when I received the email. It was sort of this like dream moment. And I worked with an incredible editor there, Amy Canonico. And I always want to make sure she's credited because oftentimes editors are the unsung heroes of academic publishing. And she made this a better book. Absolutely. So I'm indebted to her and the whole team at Yale that made this into such a beautiful project. And so along the way, then you finish the manuscript, you're in dialogue with your editor. Once they okay it for circulation, they're then going to identify experts in your topic who can read the manuscript, provide comments. Usually there's a questionnaire kind of that the press would like to hear. And then you write a full letter evaluation, typically many pages, about the contributions of the book, where it might be improved, any changes that would need to be made prior to publication, maybe suggested bibliography, and then ultimately whether or not they think it should be published. So like tenure, it's a very scary process. Yeah. A lot of peer review in academia, which is great. It makes our work better. And so once you receive comments and feedback, you can, depending on what the content of that feedback is and recommendations, you either move forward with responding to that feedback, saying how you're going to integrate it, what you might not integrate, and why, right? You send that back to the editorial board. You take the time you need to make the changes. Then after that, there are more stages still. You think you've reached the end.
I thought this was the end.
No, I wish. Then you need to do your art log. This has 140 images in it. So I needed to say what size I wanted each of those images to be approximately for the designers, whether I wanted it in black and white or color. I had to get subvention grants to offset the costs to the publisher, which they gave many, but I wanted a lot of color. So I went out and got grants, which thank you, FSU and New Foundation of Art History supported the book. I then had to get permissions for all of these images. So both the copyright from the artist and then the copyright of the photograph of the work if it's not a one-to-one. And you know all about this, but most people don't. And
it's awful.
It takes a long time. And I was very lucky in that I had copyright permission from Pistoletto for all of his work. But that doesn't mean he has copyright clearance for all of the photographers, right? So going about image payments, making, the finances of that, what I can cover with grants, what I needed to get other funding for, what I had to pay for personally, which fortunately was to a minimum, but, that comes into consideration. I had great support from my university, so thank you again, FSU, which was fantastic. And then finally, once that is all submitted, then you go into page proofs. And so I had two series of prelim pages. I had integration from a copy editor of their comments that I had to respond to. That was at Yale. Then I had a proofreader. Then I had the indexer, whom I gave some input to. I want to make sure these terms are in the index. And then, reading and giving comments, making sure that the comments have been integrated round to round. And then finally, the okay. So that took months and months and months, right? Just from what I thought was done to it actually being done. And then it went to the printer. Then there's the design for the cover. You can make suggestions on which photo or work you think would be appropriate. And Jeff Winkpaw did the cover for this, and he did a beautiful job. I'm really, really happy with it.
I love the cover.
Yeah, it's really great. So I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. It exceeded my expectations, and yeah, I'm very happy with the result. I hope people enjoy it. You know, it is a scholarly book, but it is hopefully something that if you see a Pistoletto mirror painting, they're so engaging. I hope people will pick it up at a museum just to learn more about this incredible artist and his work. Yeah.
And I know that people always say don't judge a book by its cover, but I do all the time. I will not read an ugly book. I'm sorry.
We're in the arts, we're visual people.
Exactly. They need to be beautiful.
Yes.
It is what it is. No, but the book is amazing and the cover is really wonderful, especially since it's a reproduction of a photo that's never been published before.
Never been published before. And so here he is looking in the mirror,
Very
the surface
young.
of the mirror painting. And here he is in the real space of the photograph behind.
With the little boots.
With the boots, the white Chelsea boots are so great. He has always been fashionable. And so
till this day.
To this day. And so I just thought it was this really incredible photograph, and I said I want that on the cover.
Yeah. It looks great.
Yeah.
But while you were doing also this research, you also found research for your second book.
I did.
And in development on contemporary Italian and East African art that addresses the history of Italian colonialism.
Yes.
Can you give us a little bit more details of where that's going?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really excited about this next book. And I had been writing kind of a series of articles and chapters that turned into this book project. And so, you know, some of what I was interested in is I've really seen in the last work that's been made in the last 20 years, especially, has started to quite urgently and in increasing number address histories of Italian colonialism in Africa, which is something that began in the late 19th century, first in Eritrea. And then, so this is in what we call the liberal Italy, prior to fascist Italy, that period of colonialism. Continues then through the decades, and then there's renewed colonial endeavors under the fascist state. And those begin in earnest with the invasion of Ethiopia in the 30s, and then continues through Mussolini's reign, after which, at the end of World War II, Italy is stripped of its colonies. At that time, then, there is a kind of extension of Italian colonialism insofar as Somalia is returned to Italy as a colony in a fiduciary capacity. So there was an administrative or financial organization that Italy was given over Somalia until the late 50s, right? And so there's this very strange, complicated history. And most people, including some Italians, don't know about this history because it's not known as the massive colonial power as France was, or Belgium, right, or the UK, right, and so it's always we weren't that bad, right? It wasn't that bad, right? But you look at some of these, and those ideas exist also for U.S. Americans, right? So there are complicated views towards colonial histories that often result from a lack of education about them. So this is not to, denigrate Italy necessarily about this, but there has been a kind of inattention in what some scholars of Italian colonialism, including Italian scholars who are the primary scholars who first did this research into histories, that is histories, historical scholarship of Italian colonialism, there is a kind of popular amnesia, as Angelo Loboca, this major Italian colonial historian, wrote, a popular amnesia about Italy's own colonial history. And the ramifications of that, both in the liberal and colonial periods. And there's also been amazing anti-colonial history in Italy. Many of the artists in the book, oddly, well, maybe not oddly, are from Palermo. And Palermo and Bologna are where the first anti-colonial protests were held in Italy at the end of the 19th century. So it's interesting to see artists come out of those contexts and still be making work that addresses some of the kind of latent or unseen legacies of Italian colonialism in the built environment, in the racialization of people, in xenophobia and treating of as foreign to multi-ethnic Italians who may have Italian citizenship, for example, and yet they're foreign, right? Yeah. And so histories of race that go along with this, including the racialization of Italians as white, that is part of this complicated history. And so I was really interested in artwork from the last 20 years, not exclusively by Italian artists, but also by East African artists and by Italian artists that have African heritage as well, and variously identify, but we can say Afro-Italian artists who are making work in a variety of ways to kind of call attention to this history in a number of ways. So I wanted to think about why in the last 20 years at a long, after a long period of time has passed, right? We don't have that immediate kind of post-colonial ideation in Italy following the end officially of Italian colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious as to why that was, and to why now it became so important in the visual arts to address this history. And so the book is looking at that kind of late development of post-colonial approaches to ideas about Italy, including this history, and how that affects ideas of landscape and people and social life and so on, and national identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Popular imaginaries about Italy in a global context, right? Which is always pizza, gelato, beautiful film, right? Wonderful things.
Mm-hmm.
Italy also had an endeavor in Ethiopia where tens of thousands of Ethiopians were killed over the course of 3 days because there was an attempt to unseat the Italian colonial ruler there. That's a horrible, horrible history.
Yeah.
Right. And so I wanted to think about, what are the stakes of that for, let's say, Italian Ethiopian artists? How are they addressing this? What about the Stele of Aksum, right, that was taken from Aksum in Ethiopia by Mussolini and then put on display in Rome for decades, for 70 years, only returned by Italy after it was hit by lightning, in which time, maybe it's time to return this, right? So it's an interesting history.
Really
right?
interesting.
And this also includes, as I've said, incredible Italian artists who are not, right, of African heritage and have no personal connections to this colonial history in their own families. Some of them do, right?
Mm-hmm.
As many people would in contexts where people fought for a national, also imperial power, but some of them don't. And I was curious to think about, what this history could tell us about this new area of contemporary art in and around Italy, and how it can also change global perceptions right around Italy as a country.
Yeah. No, I'm glad that you bring that up because at some point in this interview, you also mentioned Italianicity. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about what is Italianicity?
Mm-hmm.
What are the dominant narratives that need to change in regard to contemporary Italian art history?
That's a great question. It's a tough question. I'll start with the first part. So Italianicity, which I think you saw is a part of a title for a special issue I'm editing of Palinsesti, which is a journal based in Italy at the Università di Trento, on contemporary Italian art. It's an art history journal dedicated to that subject. And Denis Villa, who's the chief editor there, supported this proposal in this special issue. And the issue asked scholars to think about questioning Italianicity and redressing histories of contemporary Italian art through that lens. So Italianicity is a term famously created by the French theorist Roland Barthes in the end of the 60s in an analysis that he makes of a French advertisement for a pasta sauce, right, offered by the company Panzani, right? And he famously unpacks this advertisement, which features the tomatoes and the pasta and the red, white, and green flag on the pasta sauce label, right? The spilling tomatoes, the market bag, and says that this telegraphs to a global audience, right? It's a French company, Italianicity. That is, all of those things, that mass inventory, he said, of things that could be Italian, right? He says it's not immediately apparent to an Italian audience. They wouldn't clock this as necessarily anything in particular, right? But it was telegraphing and speaking to existing global imaginaries about what Italy is. So all those things that could be Italian doesn't mean that's what Italy actually is, right? And he said, something to the effect of Italianicity is not Italy, right? And to think about the tension between signs, right, and symbols including language, text, but also including visual forms, and how that traffics in idea and constructs ideas of what we count as what could be Italian versus some of the reality of what it could be. Right. And this is a very famous essay in the kind of visual theory, right, history of semiotics. But it also speaks to a different term, Italianità, which would be the Italian word for Italianness. Right. And so I was interested in thinking about what is happening in contemporary histories of contemporary Italian art that has been kind of under-examined, work that can help us rethink this standard idea of what we think of as contemporary Italian art. Maybe there's work that intersects with diasporic communities. Maybe there is work that deals with colonial histories. Maybe there are things that deal with constructions of race and gender that are in conflict with, or class even, that are in conflict with realities in Italy. And so it was a call to kind of invite scholarship, mostly from a post-colonial perspective, but also other, critiques that could think about grappling with a potentially different history of contemporary Italian art. So we have great contributions in the issue on film, for example, that has dealt with contemporary migration in relationship to histories of Italian colonialism. There's another article on constructions of whiteness in the Italian American context and the reception of Italian art in the United States around mid-century. I've written an article on the work of an Italian Togolese artist, Silvia Rossi, who's made incredible photographic work that reflects on her own family's history and experience in Italy. And so that is to say, some of this is about looking at that construction of what we think of visually as Italy versus some of the realities. And I will say it was difficult to get submissions, especially from art historians.
Interesting.
One of the contributors is a film historian. She comes from Italian studies. This area of my work has been better supported by Italian studies than necessarily by art history. And I think some of it just is that it's a new area of research, that there's been a so-called post-colonial turn in Italian studies that hasn't quite taken effect yet in art history. I've written elsewhere. There was a special issue of a journal, Forum Italicum, which is an Italian studies journal, but the editors invited me to kind of reflect some on my digital project in relationship to these issues. And, I've presented some of my work, and I've had, in some cases, Italian students say to me, well, these seem like very American concerns, like about fascist monuments and their stakes in Italian-built environments. But there are a number of Italian people who have these concerns, especially Italians of color. So are their concerns not Italian then? To say this sounds very American means this is not an Italian concern, right? And so, it's been interesting thinking about, I think scholars can always think about the reception of their work and kind of the stakes of that. But there's lots of work to be done, and certainly far more than, what I've done so far. And I hope this will be an area. I mean, looking at some of my students, for example, that graduate student who applied to work with me, she's at FSU now, and she's doing great work. So I'm really excited to see kind of where this will go.
Yeah. No, that's I'm extremely interested in that topic because I never even knew about it until I was at Magazzino, essentially.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
But speaking also, which you touched on a little bit about earlier in the conversation, let's talk about your digital project,
Sure. Yeah.
Which is Mapping New Directions in Contemporary Italian Art and Activism. And it's a series of live bilingual conversations, Italian and English, with contemporary Italian artists or artists who have lived and worked extensively in Italy on their work. The project generates new oral histories and testimonies from artists with shared affinities in the exploration of resistance, activism, and identity in Italy, and in cultural geographies past, present, and yet to come. Can you tell me a little bit about why you wanted to start this project? I mean, I kind of get the sense that it already feeds into the kind of the research that you're interested in.
Yeah. A few reasons. I was really interested in some of these artists' work, and I was seeing that especially in Italy, while these artists were to some degree getting extra national support, so institutions, galleries that wanted to show their work outside of Italy, many of them were receiving very little institutional interest in Italy, especially when we're talking about multi-ethnic Italian artists. And that to me seemed indicative of some of the very problems I was interested in with regard to legacies, right, of colonialism, especially legacies around race. And this is not just my own idea. There are many, many scholars, including people in the social sciences and in Italian studies, who, as well as in creative spaces, so Italian authors, literature, poetry, who have written about some of the experiences of being a person, especially being Black and being Italian, and what those experiences feel like. And so this isn't to say that all of the artists in the series are multi-ethnic Italians or who are Black Italians, variously identified. To me, it was important not to have a racialized lens or something from for the project, but to look at artists who are critically exploring these issues around colonialism and contemporary life in Italy, or other issues related to race and identity in relationship to national identity in Italy. And so there are a wide range of artists in the project. I had been really interested in some of them. I had written some about their work, particularly around, there was a moment in 2020 where a sculpture, a monument dedicated to an Italian journalist, Indro Montanelli, a very famous Italian journalist, that had been defaced in the wake of the murder of George Floyd.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah. And it had been covered in red paint, and on the base of the monument, which is in Milan, it said, I think it's razzista, stupratore, so racist, rapist. And Montanelli, earlier in his life, had been a soldier with fascist Italy in the colonial contexts of East Africa. And he had, under the practice then of Madamismo, he had married a very young, 12 or 13-year-old Eritrean girl named Desta. And this was already well known in Italian history. The incredible journalist Elvira Banotti, who helped establish the Rivolta Femminile, the Italian feminine revolt. This was the first major Italian feminist group in Italy. She had called into question this history. How can we revere this journalist, this man, when he had this horrible past in public contexts in Italy? So this was well known, and this footage circulated right around 2020 when this monument to Montanelli had been defaced for the second time. And there was a call by Ijaba Shego, who's an author, a Somali-Italian author, and also by Black Italian curators, people like Joanna Africot, who's now at the American Academy, who were looking at this response and Shego's call to have artists monumentalize and memorialize Desta, not Montanelli, right, in the end of this. And so there had been responses. There was a street artist in Palermo who made a collaborative mural dedicated to Desta. There was a mural put up in Milan that was defaced 3 days later, done by the street artist Osmo. Both of these artists are in the series. Mm-hmm. That created an image of, in the case of Osmo, an image of a contemporary Eritrean girl, young girl, so from today, on a different sculptural base like that of Montanelli's monument, and put up right in Milan. And so there were these efforts, but then they were also, in that case, defaced. So I was looking at that in relationship to some of what I saw as institutional politics in Italy that, especially in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, which did result in, especially with the defacement of Montanelli's monument, did create kind of opportunities, especially for Black Lives Matter in Italy, to advocate, right, for attention to xenophobic and especially anti-Black violence in Italy that was also ongoing, right? So there's a kind of affinity transatlantically in these moments. And there were moments where major murders or assaults against Black people, whether migrants or Italians, had been attacked, right, and harassed by police and murdered in some cases. And so looking at comparable histories of anti-Black violence in that country, I was thinking about that and artistic responses to that alongside kind of limited institutional attention to some of the work of artists making this work, making work about these issues. And, street art in both cases. So I was thinking about that and looking at how there tended to be a lot of short-term programs dedicated to some of these artists' work. But in the case of the street artists, both were white, but other artists, Black Italian artists, Luigi Vegetti Cancu, who I did a show for at FSU later, Jim Perucchini, Binta Dia, Silvia Rosi, who then later was nominated for the Maxi Bulgari Prize. She did not win, but her work has been collected in major international institutions, including half of her show from last summer is now at MoMA, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, at the time, it was all short-term programs. You didn't see the investment long-term in acquisitions, right? And that kind of bothered me. And it didn't make sense to me that you had this great proliferation of incredible artwork, but kind of limited engagement with it by Italian institutions. Now, there are exceptions. Simone Frangi is an Italian curator who's done amazing work in this space. There have been shows dedicated to contemporary art looking at migration in Italy, but the artists included are almost, any of the artists of color who included are almost never Italian, always from somewhere else. So that kind of bothered me. And I thought, well, I don't have a curatorial appointment, but I do have Instagram. I do have social media, right, for all of its problems. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to bring kind of more attention to these artist practices? You know, I am an art historian. I am really interested in their work. It'd be wonderful to also think of a format that wouldn't be too labor intensive in terms of their time, but could also be generative, not just for me as a scholar, but for them. So the format was to focus on one artwork of their choice, right? So rather than the typical "tell me about your whole career" things that get asked repeatedly, that's not particularly helpful for artists. And fortunately, almost everyone said yes who I approached, and I'm so grateful to all of them for their collaborations. And I wanted it to be bilingual, in part for my students to see the importance of learning other languages, and also to have the artists be able to speak most comfortably, right, about their work. In some cases, if they just wanted to speak in Italian, I would then add subtitles later. So they're not all bilingual live in that regard, but most of them are. And it was a fantastic endeavor so far. I've learned so much about their work. I've gone on to collaborate more with other artists. Marinella Senatore participated, and I had met her at Magazzino, and I had participated in her work there. I then invited her to be in the program, which she generously did. And then, later I was writing on her work for the show at Mazzoleni. And so some of this is, ongoing collaborations. There was a work that we discussed in Costellazione by Vegetti Cancu, who is an artist based around Milan. And that work I had discussed with him in Costellazione. He was the second episode, way back in the fall of 2020. And that work was then acquired by Mudec in Milan. And then now it was just published on the cover of a Routledge companion volume to African diaspora art history. And the editor of that volume, Eddie Chambers, who's a full professor and art historian at UT Austin, but also a major artist from the British Black Arts Movement. He said, I had known this work. I was really interested in it. And so we found that we had both had this interest in his work. And so it's nice to see these kinds of organic trajectories forward. And, it was also a labor of love, that project. And I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to do it.
And I know that recently it's slowed down a little bit. Are you planning on reviving it?
I am planning on reviving it. I've been speaking to a couple of artists. I had to pause it in part to finish my book.
Yeah, of course. This is a lot of work.
And I had a very fast clip early on. So I generated a lot of content in 2020 to 2021 during the lockdown. And so I am planning to revive it. I think currently there are 13 episodes. There is one non-Italian artist who participated, who was Alfredo Yar, who's a Chilean-born American artist, and he, or artist based in America. Yar has worked extensively in Italy and on histories of Italian thought related to these issues, particularly Gramsci. learned later that he also was an instructor of Marinella
Oh,
on a seminar on aesthetics of resistance.
look at that.
So yeah, I worked with him. I approached him. He had done a project in Venice in 2013, and I said, you've made all this incredible work. I would love you to talk about this. And he said yes, which was incredible. So he's kind of the one exception to the rule otherwise for the framework.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to it coming back.
Mhm.
Now, since we touched a little bit about the fact that you worked with Marinella at Magazzino and we were talking about Magazzino, I wanted to touch on your time there
Sure.
because you were actually the first American scholar
was, yeah.
in residence at Magazzino,
Yeah.
which is an Italian institution.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to apply to this residency, how you found it, and what attracted you to it?
Yeah, so I knew about Magazzino, world-class Arte Povera collection. I was so excited that it was made publicly available in the US. I mean, what an incredible, in terms of a model of collectors, during this process of the book, it became acutely, I became acutely aware of the fact that, many works, as you also know, are bought at auction and then disappear.
Yeah, we never see them
We
again.
don't see them again. They live in a warehouse somewhere, and that is maddening to me. And so to see collectors, Giorgio Spano and Nancy Olnick, take their collection, put it on display publicly, right? Make that free and accessible to people. I think that's just so incredible. So I was delighted to have access to the collection. I've been wanting to get up there. I got a grant from my college to go up and do research in the research center there. They also have
Because you were at
wonderful-
FSU at this time.
I was at FSU at the time. And this was in the spring of 2019 when I first went. And I was up there for 3 days, I think, of research and to see the collection. And I remember meeting the first scholar in residence while I was there, who I had known just from around, but not really formally met, Francesco Guzzetti.
Yep.
And it was just such an incredible place. And I just thought, this is fantastic. And so when the opportunity came to apply, I was delighted to do so. And thrilled, obviously, when I was selected as scholar in residence. It was the moment of a lifetime in a lot of ways, to get the time and space to sit with those works, to write about what I was writing about in that environment. It just it was an extraordinary experience. And we did go into the pandemic while I was there, and so fortunately we were able to shift some of the programming that I was working on with Magazzino online. You were there for
yes,
that. It
I
was
remember.
quite a challenge, but it worked out in the end. And it's an amazing place and expanding. I was able to go up for the opening of the new building as well. And it's an exciting place. I'm so glad that they have been so supportive of scholars. That's a really valuable opportunity for scholars to have that time and space to research and write, and to do it in the presence of that collection.
And some of the things that you were researching at Magazzino eventually made it to this book.
Yes.
Okay.
So the lecture I gave as a result of some of my research there for the lecture series that I organized, that is the third chapter of the book,
Okay.
and to some form of it, right? And so I was able, while I was there, to also, from the benefit of being in New York, I was able to, for example, go and see, there's an important work of the mirror paintings with political subjects at the Johnson Museum at Cornell. And they were the registrar while I was at Magazzino, put up a viewing room for me, got it out, let me inspect it. It was really exciting to get to spend more time with some of the artworks in the book. I also was able to do research with the Smithsonian Archives that are in DC, but they have satellite materials in New York. At the Met, right? There were lots of places that I could take advantage of, which was really exciting, not to mention Magazzino's own special collections.
And when you're looking for these artworks that you want to see, do you pull that information from the archive? How do you find out where these works are?
So some of the works we don't know where they are.
Okay.
There was one work I tried to find that was in that Walker show, and it had last had a collection name attached to it of somebody who had family ties in Beacon. And I tried it, and a friend of a friend was able to find, they remembered it from their childhood, but it's no longer in the family collection. They don't know what happened to it. And that was, heartbreaking. But most of them, the foundation knows where they are. And I was able to, depending on, obviously there's privacy standards, but depending on that, I could track down some of the works. Some of the provenance records also came from my research at the Walker, which I did right before I went to Magazzino. So I spent some time there in August of 2020 in the archives, exhibition archives at the Walker, and was able to find, received materials from them by scan during the dissertation, but I wasn't able to go in person. So to go in person and look through things, I was able to find out a little bit more information. And in some cases, as archives are living institutions, and also at museums I've visited, I've been able to correct records and say, well, I have proof from this archive about this.
Yeah.
And so that helps too. And I'm sort of thinking now, like, what do I do with my research archive from this book? Like I have so much, I'm not quite sure what to do with it or where it should ultimately go. But in any case, yeah, it's a little bit of a detective work, you know?
Essentially.
Yeah, sometimes I would work with auction houses, and in all cases they were very helpful. I worked with Phillips and with Christie's, whom had sold works that were of relevance to the book, and I needed photography. And I especially wanted photography of the mirror paintings that wouldn't sort of clean up the reflections. Oftentimes they're not you just see like a gray surface, but they're quite reflective.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that there were images of them in the book that showed that, right? And so I would reach out to the auction house and say, hey, you had this sale. I would love a different photography if you have it. Do you have it? Can you release it to me? Can you tell me where it is? And while I wasn't able to find out where they lived exactly, collectors in those cases did release photography. So that was helpful. That's not the case with all collectors.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There was a work in the book that's on long-term loan to the Milwaukee Museum and publicly on view. The collector of that work would not allow the museum to release photography to me. So
I wonder why that is.
I have no
wouldn't
idea.
You want your work in a book?
You would think it makes it more valuable.
Exactly.
But I guess not. And the museum, obviously working with a lender, wasn't going to give that to me, even though he has no control over the copyright of the book or of the work. And so I hired a photographer and said, can you go to the museum and photograph the work for me? And that's what he did. And so that's the image that's in the book.
That's a helpful tip to like do a little, loop around.
I found a friend of a friend of a friend through Facebook to find a photographer who was willing to go and do it for me, and photographed it exactly how I wanted it, and it's a beautiful image as a result. But it's sometimes you have to get creative.
Yeah.
Which you did.
And persistent.
Yeah, persistence and creativity. But no, those artworks are a nightmare to photograph. I know, because when we were working at Magazzino, we had to take photos of it. So you have to work with a really skilled photographer to get it just right.
Yeah, they're really tricky to photograph. And especially given some of the politics about how they've been reproduced, I wanted to make sure that there were images that captured what they are like, in real life. And so in the reproduction of the photo of the work Vietnam, which is at the Menil in Houston, they offered me two options. One, a kind of object photo that didn't show anything reflected in the surface, and then one with people looking in it. And I went with the latter. Yeah. I said, I want to use the one where you can really see, and so I think it gives a good sense of what these works are like in real life.
Yeah. We touched a little bit also on your love of all things Italy and where it stemmed from. And you briefly mentioned that you were also part of the Italian Art Society in one capacity or another for a very long time.
Yes.
I mean, you served as a committee member and then became president.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about more about your time there?
Sure. Yeah. So this is an organization that's been around since the late 80s, and it's a scholarly organization, but that includes faculty, independent scholars, students as well, especially graduate students. And it's an organization dedicated to the study of Italian art and art history and architectural history in North America. We have programs. I got involved in the organization when I was a graduate student. It used to be, and still is, predominantly Renaissance art historians, but also medievalist art historians. There is a small but mighty, I think, modernist contingency, myself included, and that changed. I'm not sure the exact time period, but at some point the organization thought, well, if we call ourselves the Italian Art Society, we really should include other subfields, and so that's when modern contemporary people were really invited in, which was wonderful. And I'm somebody who also reads lots of scholarship from other subfields, including Renaissance art history, and some of the scholarship I love most has come out of that subfield. You think about broader contributions in theory and method, it's valuable to read outside your subfield. So in any case, it's this working organization. I was president for the last 2 years. I just rolled off, which is, it was wonderful to do it. I established a book prize while I was there. So we just announced our inaugural book prize winners. Dr. Leah Clark at Oxford was the winner for her new book at Cross-Cultural Objects in Renaissance Courts, right, in Italy. And so it's a really great organization to help give small grants for conference travel, for research travel, publication awards. And you also just get to meet other scholars, right, working in a similar area. Sometimes you can help out somebody who's, I remember years ago, somebody reached out to me. I found your name in the IAS directory. You've done work in Turin. How do I get into this one archive? And I said, okay, here's what you do. Make sure you do this, the unwritten rules of access to places. Yes. And so, those kinds of things can be really, really helpful. And it's, I always like sharing that knowledge because you don't need to reinvent the wheel, and it's already so hard to go and do research in other places. And so that's what, that organization has been. The new president is also a modernist, so that's exciting. Anja Gamble, you
guys are taking over.
Yeah, that's one view of it. but I've loved being a part of the organization, and we do have now some grants for membership. So especially if you're a graduate student, Italianist graduate students, please look into it.
Great. Helpful tip. Awesome. Yeah. How was it accessing archives in Italy? I can only imagine, because some of them are so chaotic. I'm sorry to say. Like I worked at Magazzino for so long, and I've been in touch with some of them, and I'm just like, I don't know how you guys are still functioning. Yeah. But okay.
Oftentimes you're looking at huge amounts of material in places that are understaffed.
Yeah.
So that I want to recognize at the outset, but they can be challenging.
Yes, to say the least.
They can be challenging. Some are very well organized. Mm-hmm. I will say Michelangelo's archivist, who I mentioned, Marco Farano, incredible archivist, very well organized archive. That is a much smaller body of material, though, than you think about like the major central state archives and national archives, like the Archivio Centrale dello Stato in Rome. Like, it's a lot. The material isn't always accessible or well preserved, and sometimes there isn't air conditioning. It's just it's a lot, and people do the best they can, and obviously state funding and things are involved in it. So I don't want to be a complainer, right, in that regard. It can be challenging. I think sometimes too, you're dealing with systems where you'll have a paper catalog to get a code, and then you have to enter it into a computer station, but then you don't know, and nobody tells you you need to drop certain letters from that code until you ask, and then they show you. And so just the mechanics of it can be really elaborate and difficult. And that takes I always tell my students who go and do research in Italy, I've said, be prepared, right? You're going to need to learn how to navigate these places, and also get people to trust you. Mm-hmm. People don't, unless it's a public archive, right? People don't necessarily have to show you things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So learning kind of cultural norms, right, around requesting access, that can be a really valuable skill. Cultivating trust with artists, right? Archives can be really tricky to work with, and it's always kind of a balance between documentation, right, of archival material and working with it, depending on how long you're there. Do you end up just photographing so you can get as much as possible, depending on your time frame? That's why sometimes having longer, I think, periods of archival research can be really helpful, because it allows you to integrate the feedback in real time of that archival research, right, rather than just documenting and taking it home with you. So if you can, for people who are doing archival research or who are graduate students in art history, try to get some more time, try to go multiple visits so that you can learn how to navigate it. You have that, you're off and running. Mm-hmm. You can also integrate the research you're doing, so you can find other things that you might need, and you can spend time asking archivists, right, who have expertise. Do you have materials in X? Where would I find these other materials? So on and so forth. Sometimes it can be really tricky. Like their newspaper archives can be really interesting. Some are digitized in Italy. La Stampa turns a newspaper, which is also a national paper, was the first to be digitized, which was great. Corriere della Sera is also digitized, which is fantastic. And I just found out that the treasurer of IAS, her friend did that.
Oh, okay.
So that was very cool to find out. But then there are separate archives for the photographs for some newspapers, or you can only access the microfilm of a now defunct newspaper in one civic library location, and the one reel you need is the only reel that's missing. So things like that happen, and you just sort of have to take those hits in stride, and keep asking, because you never know when things will appear down the line.
That's a good tip.
Yeah.
Let's backtrack a little bit to the very beginning, which is your education, which you touched on a little bit throughout this podcast. Well, throughout this episode. You hold a BA with honors in art history from Stanford University and an MA and PhD in art history from UCLA.
Yeah.
I want to begin by asking, what made you decide on these programs / colleges?
Sure, yeah. I guess I'll start with graduate school, kind of go in reverse. So I studied modern contemporary art history at Stanford. And as I said, I did an honors project on French conceptualism, the work of Daniel Buran around 1968, and looked at his work through his contemporary career. And so I was really interested in going in a place that had people who were invested, some in histories of post-war European art, who were working on issues of art and politics, and also relationships between art and public space. And so I was really interested initially in going to UCLA to work with Mi-Wan Kwan, who was my MA advisor. And then my research interest in Italian art redirected me to a different, she was still on my committee, but sometimes those things happen. And anyway, she was also an invaluable member of my doctoral committee. So, but they had many experts in modern contemporary art. So in any case, I was really interested in going to work with Mi-Wan, and so I was seeking to get into UCLA in that regard. I also had worked as a public art commissioner after college for the city of Palo Alto. I was working in a gallery. I knew that I wanted to go back to graduate school. When I was an undergrad, I interned in every possible department I could in the University Art Museum. I started in PR, and then I went to archives, and then I went to curatorial. And I also interned one summer at Bonham's in San Francisco. And so I was kind of trying to see professionally, where I wanted to be. And I knew from those experiences, as wonderful as they were, that I did not want to be in auction houses and I did not want to be in museums. And so, the array of careers related to art history was necessarily smaller, but I'd had this wonderful research experience at Stanford. And I knew after those experiences and working in a commercial gallery and working in public art, I knew I needed to get back to graduate school. I knew I really wanted to be doing research and ultimately be in academia. And I really recommend anybody considering a PhD program, make sure you know that is what you want to do. Try everything else that you think could make you happy, because it is so exceedingly difficult and it's a long time to dedicate to something. And knowing that will sustain you, right, through the inevitable challenges of doctoral work. And so, I knew that's why I wanted to go to UCLA. And so when I got in with funding, I was delighted, and off I went to Los Angeles. I had only ever been there once. I knew no one. So I sort of stayed on the West Coast a very long time. I grew up in the Midwest. I had not planned on being in California for a long time. I don't think I really fit in California, but I loved it there. I had great education experiences. I went to Stanford. I was deciding between there and another school, and it was a hard choice. I did have a favorite aunt and uncle, I will say, in the Bay Area, and so I knew that would be nice. I also was a competitive swimmer, so I wanted to go swim for Stanford.
Oh, nice! I never knew that about you.
So I did that.
Do you still swim?
I do on occasion,
okay.
Yeah. So that was part of the decision as well. And I also was really excited about, some of the culture at Stanford. When I was doing my campus visits, I was really struck by It had all of the intellectual rigor and all of the excitement around its academics and research and so on and so forth. But it didn't seem as, if I may say, academically affected as the other school that I visited. And I just felt like maybe I could thrive more there. And so I went. And it was a great experience. So, yeah.
I'm glad that like you shared that, you've tried other experiences before committing to being like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, because a PhD in research is a lifetime commitment.
It is, and it's not to say if you do a PhD, your only trajectory is academia. In art history, that's not, in any field, that's not feasible. There are only so many jobs. And I knew I was never going to adjunct long term. That wasn't something that would make me happy. Lots of people do that, and that's great. But I just knew for me, that probably wouldn't be something that would be a good trajectory for me. So I knew I wanted to be in academia, but I knew the chances were ultimately very small. And it's always some luck. There are wonderful people, brilliant people who don't get jobs. So it's some luck and a lot of hard work. So I'm very grateful to be where I am. But, I knew that I needed to know, in order to make all the sacrifices that come into pursuing a PhD, that I would need to really know in my bones, right, that this is what I wanted. I've always been a really kind of determined person, but I knew that for it to be like a good decision for me professionally and personally, that it would help to have that knowledge and those experiences, so that I wouldn't also be left wondering, what if these other trajectories. Having that professional experience, that lived experience, can really, really help inform you. And when I got out of college, I couldn't get a job in the arts. I wanted to stay in the Bay Area, which was necessarily limiting. And I couldn't get a job. So I was hostessing just to pay my rent. And I was applying for a job at Google, which was a long process there at the time. And I did get that job, and I had a contract in hand, and I met this woman who was opening a gallery. She said, "Let me interview you." And I said, "Okay," and she offered me a job. And I sort of took a leap of faith, and I didn't take the job at Google because I wanted to be in the arts. And so I worked for her for her gallery. It was on contemporary British art for a couple of years, and also then was working in public art. And so I will always be grateful for that opportunity. But it was, it was a random occurrence to some degree. And I'm so glad I did that, because I'm not sure I would have necessarily made it back to graduate school at all if as quickly as I did. I had lots of friends go and work for Google. We were at Stanford. It was kind of to some degree a feeder pool, and they were very happy there, right? And so who's to say what would have happened? But
I was about to say, I'm like, imagine how different your life would have been if you went to Google.
Very different.
Yeah. So then, essentially, you went on to, you do your PhD. I wanted to know, what was it like for you to find work post PhD?
Yeah, good question. So terrifying.
Okay. Like, where do you even begin?
Yeah, so I taught some classes at UCLA, which was great, both while I was finishing and after. And so that was, good opportunity. I remember was tutoring some people, giving them input on graduate applications, essays, odd jobs like that. I remember I did some translation for somebody who was communicating with the Italian consulate and some things. So it was sort of hodgepodge together. And it was a tough time. I had some family support. I was married at the time, so that facilitated it. And, I always acknowledge those kinds of moments of privilege, because it would have been much more difficult without that. And then I was still writing and going to conferences, and went on the job market and was able to get, I had a number of interviews, but I was able to get a visiting position at Washington College, which was on the eastern coast of eastern shore of Maryland, small liberal arts college, really old college. And they hired me, and I was elated. And I could teach some specialty courses. I was also teaching survey courses, some of their more intro-level courses, but they also let me teach, specialty courses that I wanted to teach, which was fantastic. I had great colleagues there. Students were fantastic. And so, but I kind of moved there on a leap of faith for the year-long position. I was a sabbatical replacement, so no guaranteed job at the end, and just thought, okay, let's hope that I now have time to go on the market again for the next cycle, it's an academic year cycle for academia, and I'll just keep my eye out for jobs and hope, right? And so I was teaching all these classes while also trying to publish so that I could be attractive as a job candidate. And then I went on the market, and I remember, oh my gosh, it was so much work. I was conferencing. I had to go down to give, I had a campus visit at FSU for my job. And I remember my students were taking a midterm at Washington College. And I was so worried. I'd set it up for them to take it online. And I was so worried and there was some tech problem. And I was on a bathroom break during the visit, and I'm texting, trying to make, it was awful. I'm eating a protein bar. Campus visits are Herculean efforts. You're interviewed from the moment you set foot on the ground with the nicest of people, right, to the moment you leave. And so it's very high stress, and the stakes are high. And I got the job at FSU, and I was just elated. It was the dream to have an R1 Research One institution position. So apply everywhere. In academia, you're completely beholden to where the job is. People are always like, oh, well, don't you want to live in X, Y? Well, yeah, but you go where the job is.
Right.
And I have to say, having lived in, I think, a very desirable place of Los Angeles, and now living in what might not be regarded as so desirable in North Florida, cost of living makes a difference.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And, I Los Angeles as a graduate student was very tough.
Yeah.
And so I didn't really get to enjoy the city a lot and all of the resources it has. So I'm very happy where I am. It is a good place to work and do research. Cost of living is good. So those are things I think to take into consideration too. Even if you're not in academia, it sort of dispels the whole, you can go work wherever. Can't you just get a job? No, it's like a miracle to get a tenure track job. And, If that's really what you want, you go where the job is.
Yeah. Do all universities have the research sort of tenure track that you do, or are they only specific universities?
So some institutions do not give tenure.
Okay.
Not a lot, but some. There are also, I believe so community colleges are a little bit different. You can get a great education in community colleges. Oftentimes, there are people who really love teaching there, PhDs who love teaching and who can do great things at community colleges. So some of my best students actually at FSU have been transfer students from community colleges. So community college is kind of one route in academia. They do have tenure. They don't all have tenure. Then and they have a promotion system. Then there are like liberal arts colleges, four-year colleges that don't have graduate programs. Those will be more teaching intensive. They typically have tenure. Sometimes you have positions at arts colleges. Arts colleges don't always have tenure. So there are some people where you don't have tenure, but you can get promotions and infinitely renewable contracts. It depends on the place. Then there are research universities where you're going to have, you'll have your four-year undergraduate degree, and then you'll have graduate programs as well. Or you'll have a four-year program, but not necessarily a graduate program, but you're part of a major university. So there are different kind of tiers and types of institutions in higher ed, and there are kind of R1 is top research university. R2 would be second tier research university. And those are determined through a number of factors. And then you have, so on and so forth, and liberal arts colleges, which can be quite prestigious institutions. And then you'll have community colleges. So it depends on the institution, and then it depends on the type of the institution, and then it depends on the specific institution as well.
Okay. Wow. That seems very complicated.
It is.
For us non-academics.
Yeah.
So then after you mentioned you were at Washington College, can you tell us a little bit about your time there?
Yeah. So It's located in Chestertown in Maryland, tiny town on the eastern shore of Maryland. My mom is from DC, so I grew up going to DC a lot to see my grandparents growing up, and loved DC, but I'd never been to the eastern shore of Maryland, and it's kind of incredible. It's this beautiful place. In an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half, you're in DC. But there's one bridge to get across the bay. And, it was 45 minutes north of that bridge entrance to the Eastern Shore just to get to Chestertown. So tiny town, beautiful, idyllic, old. I ended up coming in with a cohort of people, one of whom is still a very dear friend. She's in the Department of English there, whom she had done her PhD in English at UCLA while I was there, and we had never met.
Wow.
And so sort of made great friends there. And we were all, in this early moment. And it was a great place. It was a combined art and art history department. So I had a lot of art students, which I always love. And I did a symposium with a seminar I did for a class on modern contemporary women artists. And there were wonderful presentations from that group. And, it was also nice because we were able to take students to major institutions. So my art history colleague there, Ben Tillman, and I one day took students to the BMA. And to the Walters. And, it was this incredible field trip. I was able to take students to the National Museum for Women in the Arts to see a special show. Great museum. And so it was a very cool place to get to be for a year. And I thank them in the book for, giving me a home for a year. Yeah. Really. Because without them, I wouldn't be where I am.
Yeah. So. But that still must be stressful. I mean, you have a 1-year contract, and then, you have to already start looking for work once you essentially get there.
Right away.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was very stressful.
Yeah.
Very, very stressful. It's the stress of academia cannot be understated. And I know that sounds like, well, how can you say that? You're all in ivory towers, but it's very stressful because of the precarity of it. Mm-hmm. If you want to stay in it, not everybody gets to stay in it. And that's not to say you can't go do incredible things. There's a lot of discussion in recent years in higher ed discourse around what are sometimes called alt-ac or alternative to academic positions, alt-ac positions. You have highly transferable skills. Yeah. And there are a lot of things that you can do with PhDs in humanities disciplines. I think sometimes art history suffers from a kind of popular reputation of professional inutility, right? What are you going to do with an art history degree? And it's kind of like, what can't you do with an art history degree? It's not to say, certainly it's nice to go into a career in the arts if you can, but if that's not an option, or you want to stay in a certain area and so you're making different choices, you have the ability to read things visually that no other discipline does. And that you can go into advertising, you can go into consulting, you can work in a variety of business contexts, you can go into graphic design, you can so on and so. You can also read and write. You can write well. That's your medium, right? So there are many, many things that you can do. There are a variety of museum institution positions, lots of different kinds of museums as well. You can work in community arts, so on and so forth. So, and I always tell the Google story to students because, students can say, my parents are worried, and I am familiar with that refrain. It's look, you want your kid to succeed, right? I totally understand that. And there's this expectation, I think, with art history that it's going to be useless. But I always tell them the Google story because art historians are what these companies are looking to hire. You can write, right? You can analyze texts and images and think about that in a way that other disciplines can't. And so that is an invaluable skill.
It's interesting that you say about Google because actually one of my a friend of mine from undergrad who we did the art history program together with is at Google in their New York headquarters.
There it is.
So that's actually true. You can just go to Google if you're really worried. But before we head into the final round of questions, I want to ask you what I ask all my guests at the end. The first one being, have you faced any challenges in particular as a woman working in the field?
Yes, absolutely. And it's... Yeah. I think some of it in academia that's hard is, and that I mentioned to you before when we were chatting, is that I love that you were going to ask me this question because it gave me time to really think about it. I think conventional ideas of femininity are completely at odds with conventional ideas about intellectuals and academics. And that, therefore, when I navigate spaces of academia as a feminine, cisgender woman, there tends to be a disconnect with the attributes that I would hope people would see in my work as a professional academic, as a professor, as a researcher, as an art historian, as a critic, so on and so forth. And yet I'm already at a disadvantage because of that. And, I see male colleagues of mine navigate these spaces and they are just instantly respected. They are seen as intellectual without saying anything, without doing anything. They could be meeting students for the very first time, and it's instant respect, and that's not, their fault, right? It's just socially how these ideas have been constructed, historically visually how these ideas have been constructed. And so, yeah, I've had, horrible things said to me. I had a colleague, not at FSU and not at Washington College, and not at UCLA either, different place, say to me they'd prefer a smile while they were apologizing to me. Wow. So that was interesting. I've had things said to me that, I should aspire to have the congeniality of a beauty pageant. Yeah, I don't appreciate those comments.
Neither would I.
Truly horrible. And in some cases, you're being evaluated. That it's a small field. It's been hard. I think now that my book is out, that I have tenure, that I have a publication record, that my students are going on and doing things, I've really worked hard to be treated the same way as male colleagues are in the field. That's still not the case, right? But I certainly am at far more advantage than my colleagues who are women of color, and I'm acutely aware of that. So, it's, I always chat with some of my female colleagues. We just have to champion each other, always celebrate each other's achievements, always make sure that we're happy and promoting one another, happy for each other, not in a competitive way, but really, truly happy for each other's achievements, because they're not seen as much. They're not celebrated the same way. The way our work is evaluated, you're not just instantly respected. I've also really looked up to senior scholars in the field, women in the field, whom I've had the privilege to see speak and navigate the things that come with being a woman in academia. I once saw a very famous Italianist art historian who works on modern contemporary art, who has been at the top of her field for decades, get a kind of little bit of a mansplaining comment in a conference, and she just sat there and listened. And then when he was done, she responded with the most professional decorum and intellectual might, and it just dispelled all of that to everyone. And it was incredible to watch. And I just thought, how many times has she had to do this? That she can do this well.
Yeah.
And so I just said, be like that, And I mean, I had a comment to somebody on a post about my book, a guy I had never met, who thought he would point out to me how old Michelangelo is and that he still takes long trips. And I just thought, I thought about Rebecca Solnit. You know that book of essays, Men Explain Things to Me? Mm-hmm. So she wrote about an experience where she had published a book, and a man at a party was then telling her, when she said she was, I write about X, Y, and Z, they said, oh, well, you should really read blah, 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 and started telling her about her own book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I just thought, men explain things to me.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's literally what every woman's life. That would be the book.
Constant.
It's constant.
Yeah.
It's nonstop. Yeah. But thank you for sharing that,
Sure.
because I mean, we all go through through this essentially to one degree or another.
Yeah.
And my second question is, do you have any advice for incoming generations of women who are looking to work in the field, especially in academia?
Yeah. Find mentors.
Mm-hmm.
Ask questions. Reach out to graduate students in programs that you're considering. Ask them what their experience is. Ask them what their experience with their specific advisor is. Really learn as much as you can. Think less about geographical location. Think about with whom are you going to go work, right? You're not there forever.
Mm-hmm.
And you really only get to go to graduate school once, conventionally, right? Make the very most of it. Make sure you can get a mentor who is going to mentor you. It might not be the super famous person with whom you get to meet once a semester, right? That model is going away, fortunately. But ask students about their experience for sure. Try other fields first, right? Try all those other things that you think, if you can imagine yourself being happy doing anything else,
Literally anything,
go do that.
Yeah.
Right. And because it's not for everybody. It's being an art historian and an academic art historian, you're spending a lot of time alone.
Mm-hmm.
And writing is hard and research is hard. And you'll be in a PhD program for a long time and you'll see your peers move forward professionally and financially. And that can be, exciting to watch, but also kind of hard because you're making nothing and wondering if you'll get a job at the end. And so, there are financial realities and professional realities to consider. If you know that's what you love, go do it. Go for it, Find mentors who will help you, who will champion you. Only go someplace that you're funded. You do not want to come out of a doctoral degree with mountains of debt. You think that you can manage, don't do that, right? Make sure you're funded. Do everything you can from day one in a graduate program to help your professionalization. That's not necessarily on your program or on your advisor. That's on you. That's learning how to independently manage that. That's part of graduate school. So there are some great guides out there to help you. Karen Kelsky's book, The Professor at Zinn, was really helpful to me when I was a graduate student. It's still something I use with my students. Make sure you're giving conference talks. Make sure you're trying to publish. Make sure you're doing those things that will help you set yourself up for success.
That is great advice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are you ready for the fire round
I
of
am.
questions
I'm ready.
now? Okay. So essentially, I have 10 questions. We probably have time for like 3 or 4.
Okay.
And then you pick a number between 1 and 10, and I'll read the corresponding question.
Okay. All right.
Pick your first one.
7.
7. What is something that you think everyone should experience in their lifetime?
Travel.
Okay.
Travel. It doesn't even mean long distance. Just go someplace else, right? It could be to a town in your state, right, that you get on a bus or get in your car and go to. And just see something else. There's so much out there. If you can travel outside of the country, do it, right? It's especially for Americans.
I was just going to say.
Especially for Americans, there's so much out there, and so many incredible cultures and places and languages and traditions to experience and encounter. And the world is a big place.
Yeah.
Right. And so try to travel, I think that's it. You learn so much from experience and you think differently about your place in the world as a result from it. And I think it can be humbling and scary and exciting and invigorating. And we have so much beauty in the world. There's so much good out there and people are different. And that's wonderful and exciting. And I think it's always good to, if you can, go someplace where people are not like you.
Yeah.
Right? Go see what that's like.
Yeah.
Right? You can always learn so much through that.
100%. I love traveling. The more I learn about other people and cultures, that to me is the point of being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just, there's so much out there. It's such a big place, right? And I am a different person because of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, another one.
Okay. 2.
2, name a book or film that had a profound influence in your life.
Mhm. That's a really good question. Book or film? I saw there was this Italian film that I watched when I was in graduate school. I had a good friend who was in film studies and who recommended it to me, and it was Romano Olmi's Il Posto, The Job. And it was a film, a kind of a late neorealist film. I think it was filmed in 61, maybe 60. And I actually mention it in the book, but that's not why I mention it here. It was this incredible film about this young kid in Milan during this period of intense industrialization in northern Italy. And lots of people weren't, especially middle class or lower, it was still very, very hard. The country's recovering, and he's trying to get a job. And he goes into the city and is trying to get a job, trying to get hired. And you see him kind of navigating this really precarious time of his life, and in a moment where so much around the country around him is changing. And he befriends this girl, and they're walking through the streets together, and it's all sort of in real time, and those long shots you get with neorealism. And I just thought it's a pretty sad film in the end. He gets a job, but only because somebody has died. And then he's sort of resigned to this clerical position in the end. And it's sort of this existential film about kind of grappling with becoming an adult and with areas of kind of minimal opportunity, but also in a time of excitement, right? They look in windows together and look at, new electrical appliances and things like that. And I just thought it was the most beautiful film. And it was tied, to what I was thinking about at that moment in Italy and in history. And so much of this project has made me always want to be able to go back in time to that moment. And especially in Turin, this was in Milan, but and I know Milanese will say that it's so far from Turin, it's an hour by train. And I think it just gave me like a little bit of kind of a slice of life, right, of that moment, and an understanding of some of the like emotions of that period. And it's a really great film.
I'm gonna have to look it up. I've never seen it.
Yeah, it's a great one. Really, really beautiful. Olmi, Olmi is the director.
Okay, another one.
Okay. Number 9.
9. What do you always travel with?
Ooh. I try to always have a novel.
Okay.
Yeah. Because invariably, part of this has to do with the fact that I always worry about my cell phone battery dying. And I'll have battery packs and everything, but I don't want to just be plugged in and using it the whole time in transit. So I'll have a novel. And I also don't read enough for pleasure. I'm always reading for work. So
I was going to say,
I see it as this opportunity, right, to read something. Sometimes it's a poetry book. I read a lot of poetry. But I try to have something else not related to work to read, for fun.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, one last one.
Number 1.
Name an artist you admire.
Well, aside from the obvious, I'm going to say Mel Bachner.
Okay.
And I just learned of his passing from you just a few days ago. I hadn't heard the news yet, and I thought I was able to work with Mel when we were both at Magazzino, and he continued to be accessible to me afterwards. I've been writing an article on minimalism, and he wrote some really important criticism early in his career about it and made works sort of influenced by that in his early career when he was this young kid in New York. And he gave me an oral history interview for hours, and he just was so funny and so smart. And I'm just really sad that he's gone. What an incredible artist. Really smart, really funny. And the way he thought about information and language and translation and the world around us, he was really an incredible, incredible artist.
Yeah. I really loved his sense of humor.
He was so funny. Oh, he was so funny. So I'm really heartbroken he's gone, and so honored to have gotten to know him just a teeny bit.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Tenley, for being here, for sharing everything. I've learned so
Thank
much,
you so much,
in this
Carolina.
chat, and I'm sure everyone viewing this will too. So thank you for sharing all of that
Thank you
information.
so much. This is a great program. I'm really honored to be a part of it.
Of course. And then to everybody, please get Michelangelo Pistoletto, Figuration and Cultural Politics, which drops March 2025, March 18th in 2025. So
you can
very
pre-order
soon.
now.
Yes, you can pre-order it now. Definitely check it out. And thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.